What I'm about to say, you'll say, oh my God. But what I'm about to say is what kind of everybody educated believed in the first half of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And it would be that pretty much at the moment of conception, there's this thing called general intelligence that's fixed.
Do you like books?
I'm outlining a new writing project.
Who wrote this book?
Read it. Reread it.
Sometimes I'd write something.
What are you writing?
Have you written anything lately?
I'm Amanda Stern, and this is Bookable. On today's show, raging against the testing machine. There's a lot of intense criticism of systems lately.
The system is broken.
The unraveling that happens to that system.
Who have been victims of this system.
The system is on trial now.
The system is rigged. The system is corrupt.
Most of the focus has been on the perpetuation of structural discrimination. But what about a system whose creators thought their intentions were noble? Well, if it's based on a faulty premise, it's just as pernicious. What happens when a world outgrows the concepts born in a different era? Hello. Hi. Come on in. Well, our guest today wrote a book 20 years ago that kicked off a heated debate about one ubiquitous American system.
You're welcome.
And it's a discussion that continues with even more urgency today.
Should I put these on?
Yes. Time for an introduction.
My name is Nicholas Lemann, and I'm here to talk about a book called The Big Test, The Secret History of the American Meritocracy, which was originally published in 1999, but is still available as a paperback. So, it still exists.
Nicholas Lemann. The Big Test is about the creation of academic testing and how it began as a system to reward intelligence over class. Based on test results, the men who scored highest would rise to the top as our leaders. In essence, these tests presupposed that intelligence was a fixed object that could be measured and therefore standardized. To understand the history of academic testing in this country, you've got to take a trip back in time to meet some guys. First up, meet Henry Chauncey.
You know, he's a main character in this book, so I got to know him very well.
Henry grew up as a member of the American elite in the early 1900s, so naturally, he was educated at Groton, a place where rich boys learned how to be good and useful. And then he would go to the school that every aspiring elite hoped to attend, Harvard.
And basically spent up to age about 40 at Harvard as a student and then an assistant dean.
So this guy was very much a product of elite academia. And while at Harvard, Henry would meet a man who changed the course of his entire life.
The president of Harvard from 1933 to 53 was a very different kind of person named James Conant.
Yup. Next up is James Conant. Conant was a reformist who railed against the American elite. He wanted to remake American society by limiting educational opportunity. Only a new elite, one that he would help choose, could attend a 4-year college and rise to the top. The only qualification? Performing well on a test. A test which at the time was thought to measure pure intelligence. These high-performing 17-year-old test takers would become our future leaders. So Henry Chauncey, influenced by his interactions with Conant, realized what he wanted to do with the rest of his life: test the entire population. He wanted to create a census of abilities.
You know, people in his generation felt the U.S. was wasting a tremendous amount of talent because there'd be all these people who had incredible abilities but, you know, spent their whole life behind a mule and a plow because there was no way to find them. And if you could have the census of abilities, then you could find them and use them to make the country greater. So Conant really had the idea of remaking first who was at Harvard, then who was at the Ivy League schools and schools like that, and then kind of who was in the American elite or leadership class. In service of that, he asked Henry to go kind of scout around and find an admissions test that he could use to kind of get a new kind of student into Harvard. So Henry went around and talked to all the people in testing and met a man named Carl Brigham, who was at Princeton and who had invented the early SAT. And then he came back to Conant and said, okay, I found your test for you. It's called the Scholastic Aptitude Test, and that's what you have to do to use to get the kind of students that you want at Harvard.
From the Big Test, page 4. The Second World War is now drawing to its conclusions, which, it's clear at last, will be a total victory by the Allies. The war has made the United States into the greatest power in the world, the central and essential civilization. That, Americans hope, will serve as a model of how to organize a society properly. The system that existed at that time was sort of a rule by wealth and inheritance.
Well, everything is relative, right? Mm-hmm. So from the outside, that's the way it looked. Mm-hmm. From the inside, that isn't the way it looked.
Okay, so what was the difference?
So let's imagine, say, the late George H.W. Bush, okay, who mm-hmm. lived inside this system. So I'm pretending to be him for a minute.
Okay.
I've grown up in this world, that is sort of sociologically distinctive. 90% of the people I grew up with didn't amount to anything. So the idea that we're a ruling class is silly. A few of us who had extraordinary abilities, of which athleticism would be equal to or greater than intelligence in value, were selected to go to places like Yale and be in organizations like Skull and Bones and then go on to serve the public. But it's not like we were a feudal-style ruling class who ruled by pure inheritance, because in our mind, I'm being George H.W. Bush mm-hmm. again, my whole life I've been competing and being, surviving winnowing contests and being groomed for leadership. So nothing was handed to me. I earned it all. That's how those people thought.
Right.
Today, people, if you happen to know any who are, quote, meritocrats, mm-hmm. if those who are not them think they didn't earn anything and they, the old line about former President Bush, they were born on third base and thought they hit a triple. But they believe they earned their status.
Right.
Right?
But Henry Chauncey and Conant wanted to redo the way that things were, the system at the time.
Conant actually, wrote like, here's my vision kind of stuff.
Okay.
Henry did not do that kind of thing. He was an administrator, but he kept a diary, so you have his sort of ideas there. But his ideas were not, less about society, which didn't interest him that much, and more about testing, which, to him was like, well, he would say occasionally, was, his came from a long line of ministers, Puritan ministers, and he thought testing was kind of the new version of religion, basically.
Okay, and so the idea of having people tested, did he think that would help to create a more just society? Like, what was his? Yeah,
he wouldn't have used a word like just.
Uh-huh.
He would have used, he felt it was scientifically better. It would. I think what he would have liked to say was, I hate to speak for him because he's not here. It would have created a more modern society, and a society that was better at matching everybody to the role that would be best for them.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want to sort of turn society upside down. That was more Conant's idea.
Okay. So
it was like a rough analogy, like if you know anybody who's a tech person and they think, technology is good, full stop, it will make the world better,
Right.
And then if you say, well, walk me through the exact way it'll make the world better, there's kind of a blank, because they're so sure it will make the world better. So that was more like Henry. I wouldn't call him a social visionary. I would call him a very, very, very gifted administrator and somebody who was able to build up an organization from nothing into a position of real influence, even though his own vision of what it should be for was sort of vague and was never realized.
From the Big Test, page 118. Of his predictions, the one that got almost all the attention was that the old lauded aristocracy would become irrelevant and would be replaced by a new upper class made up of highly intelligent, well-educated people. This resonated deeply all over the world with readers who had not been born into the old elite, but who qualified for the new one. Their moment had arrived. Can you talk a little bit about Michael Young and the origin of the word meritocracy?
Yeah, so Michael Young was a great British sociologist and a sort of political policy wonk type. So he wrote an incredibly weird, great little book called The Rise of the Meritocracy that was published in 1958. It's not really a novel. It's a dystopian fake dissertation, but it's about the British education system creating what he calls a meritocracy through IQ testing and educational sorting. And then, it ends in a bloody revolution. I teach this book to my students, and it's extremely prophetic about things like Trump and Brexit.
Wow. Really?
Well, what do I mean by that? Remember, meritocracy is a liberal idea, okay? It comes from really deep within the liberal establishment. And the fundamental irony is, all this social engineering takes place with the idea that we're going to create a new liberal elite that will make the world a much better place. It sort of works in the sense that there is this kind of different and generally liberal elite that gets created. And guess what? Everybody hates them. So instead of being beloved, they give rise to these kind of populist angry sentiments, both on the left and right. And that's kind of what Michael Young predicted in 1958.
And what are the qualities of meritocracy?
Okay, so here we get into some of the deeper problems. So there's a Greek word that's very old, thousands of years old, called aristocracy. And that means rule by the best, literally in Greek. When you hear aristocracy, what you hear is rule by the inherited elite, that by the fortunately born. So why is that? The reason is that, at least in my opinion, once you make somebody the elite, they start sort of misbehaving and in various ways, including passing on their advantages to their children. So aristocracy, as the Greeks meant it, was no longer usable in the modern world because it had degraded to this completely opposite meaning. So what Young did was he said, well, I can't use aristocracy. There's this other term, natural aristocracy, that's meant to sort of rescue aristocracy. I just have a review coming out in the Times Book Review of a book where the author tries to revive this term. But Young decided, well, I'll just take the Latin root of the first syllable and keep the Greek root of the second syllable and recreate the meaning. So it's merit is Latin and ocracy is Greek, right? So it's a sort of stitched together Latin-Greek word. And then the irony as far as Young is concerned is he invented it as something to warn against, but in conversation in America today, everybody's for it. Everybody thinks it's the founding idea of the United States, as far as I can tell.
But how did that happen?
I think it happened, the old-fashioned way, which is when you create a criterion for choosing an elite and you let that run for a generation or two, the people who are on the inside of the system think they're fabulous and they earn their status in the way I was describing a few minutes ago. Mm-hmm. And the people outside think they're a bunch of people who were born in and are privileged. So if you're inside the system, meritocracy is used as a positive. And it's only starting to sort of break down. When this book came out, a lot of the reaction was, just this kind of, huh? What? How can you question meritocracy? It's such a great idea.
Time for a short break. When we come back, we'll talk about Trekkies. No, for real. We actually are going to talk about Trekkies. And the racial implications of a test written by, and I will argue, for white men. Stick around. Failure, anger, and even wrinkles are always tricky things to grapple with and accept. But as you get older, you begin to learn how to embrace it all because you know everything will be fine. Join former Lucky Magazine founding editor Kim France and documentary filmmaker Tally Abacassis as they give us an inside look as to how they're navigating life after 40 in the podcast, Everything is Fine. Kim and Tally have honest conversations with guests about their fears, health, careers, self-care, and how to navigate being called middle-aged when they feel anything but. Whether it's what to do about gray hair, tips on always looking well-dressed, overcoming being fired, or discussing the power of being pissed off. They're always empathetic, insightful, and most of all, entertaining. Subscribe to Everything is Fine wherever you listen to podcasts. Welcome back to Bookable. I'm Amanda Stern, here with Nicholas Lemann, author of The Big Test. The Educational Testing Service, or ETS, was created in 1947 to develop and produce standardized academic tests. And they're still around today, administering the SAT, the GRE, and so many others. But ETS has come under increasing scrutiny for perpetuating systemic bias in education. In The Big Test, Nicholas writes, during all the time that ETS and other testing companies had been promoting the use of tests, it never occurred to them that the results would be used to exclude Black people, or, for that matter, that there could be any bad side to the miracle of testing. But excluding Black people was the effect.
There was nothing in the test that says only for white people or only for men. Mm-hmm. They were given to people who went to super elite high schools and wanted to go to Ivy League or Ivy League-like colleges. That group would have been almost entirely white and predominantly male at the time. But they weren't, designed, quote, for white males.
Right.
Then, during World War II, the old college boards were dropped in the SAT. So the SAT was first a scholarship student device. So it would have been given to a less fortunate group than the college boards. Mm-hmm. People, the thought was if you went to, the public high school in a Midwestern town, you couldn't take the college boards because, first of all, you couldn't get to an administration site. And second of all, you wouldn't have been prepared on the curriculum they tested for, so you would take the SAT. during the Second World War, the old college boards were abolished entirely, and everybody who wanted to go to college board colleges had to take the SAT.
Okay. Just to push back for 1 second, you said that they weren't explicitly designed for white men.
Right.
But they were designed by white men. Yes?
Right. Yes.
So,
with a few exceptions, but yeah, predominantly, yes.
Okay. So I would say that they were then designed for white men.
That gets into a whole can of worms because, I'm just picturing the days when I was at ETS all the time. And, I'd eat in the cafeteria there with all these item writers.
Uh-huh.
So the picture I want to paint a picture of these guys. They're going to lunch in the cafeteria. What do they talk about? Topic A, Star Trek. They're like the nerdiest guys in the world, and everything is about Star Trek trivia. Wow. And they think of themselves as these sort of geeky, techie psychometricians. Mm-hmm. So if you said to them, do you know that you're writing test items for white males that only white males will do well at? They would have really taken umbrage at that, even though they very predominantly were white males, because they thought they were making technical artifacts, not culturally loaded tests.
Right. And
they didn't think they were like part of an elite that was handing things over to, future elites. They thought we're just these like Trekkie, geeky guys who write test items.
Right. Well, that was when, 20 years ago?
25 more years ago, almost 30 years ago.
Wow. I wonder what they think now.
It's this is an ongoing problem. Again, there may be people out there who would disagree with what I'm saying, but my consistent impression then as now, and I don't follow it as closely, is, even back then when I was working on it, Black employees at ETS had a much, much more negative view of the organization and much more critical than white employees. Mm-hmm. But it was like a lot of situations in life where, we're in a radio studio with 3 people. And if I said to you, we're all white, so you must be racist or you must have designed your show in order to, perpetuate white privilege, you'd say, wait a minute, I just happened to invite this guest and so on and so forth. So the white hierarchy and employees of ETS were consistently mystified by the racial critique of them. The Black employees consistently got it, and there was just, starting in the 70s, really, there was this, and it's still going on, long-running drama of ETS and the College Board trying to kind of improve its relations, especially with African Americans and some white women, and kind of hitting walls on that. It was just a sort of perception gap.
Do you have any thoughts about Trump and his penchant for insulting people using a low IQ?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Trump has a lot of penchants, but one of the things that he does is he has, a lot of his self-presentation is kind of under the heading of, you're thinking it and I'm saying it. It's sort of picked up from, bad boy talk show hosts and people like that. So I think he seems to be very convinced that IQ is important and that he has a high one. I don't know if he does or he doesn't, but it's a way to insult people. And also, he's exposing some of the contradictions of the system. That is, if you go into the first year class of Yale Law School and say, who here has an IQ and thinks they're smarter than most. He has a high IQ and thinks they're smarter than most people. No one will raise their hand, but they all think it, you know? Mm-hmm. So he's sort of pulling it up. It's like, you know, a lot of this stuff it's like sexuality in Victorian England or something. It's like it's very part of people's psychology and self-concept, but they know they're not supposed to talk about it, or they talk about it in very constrained ways.
Yeah. I actually now have 2 more questions.
And also, I mean, I now teach and live in a university. Mm-hmm. I can tell you, I don't know, they won't say it very often in public, but I have a lot of private conversations where it's the flip, where they say people who vote for Trump are stupid. And they, you know, really, they're you know, Republicans or voters are dumber than Democratic voters. Mm-hmm. Look at the college ed percentages. And B, you know, they just don't have the intellectual processing capacity to understand how to vote right. You know? So both sides play the game in a way, although the liberal side plays it more quietly.
Nicholas Lemann, author of The Big Test. It's published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and this year marks the 20th anniversary of its release. Bookable is a production of Loud Tree Media. I'm your host, Amanda Stern. 5 feet tall, although I tested 6 feet. We're produced by me, Bo Friedlander, and Andrew Dunn, who also mixed and sound designed the show. Bo is Loud Tree's editor-in-chief. Find us on the web at bookablepod.com. And please subscribe and rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows. That's one of the best ways for other listeners to find Bookable. And for all of us out there working to dismantle unjust systems, persistence can pay off.
I believe that it's possible that you won't have an SAT in 5 to 10 years. I think the whole thing is sort of starting to collapse. And I'm telling you, when I published the book, it was like, this is crazy, you know? And now there's just a lot of stuff around this. There's things happening. I think this system is going to get shaken up.
This is Bookable.
Loud Tree.
Hey guys, it's Amanda, here to tell you about a new podcast from the producers of Forever 35 called Gee Thanks, Just Bought It. Hosted by author and shopping guru Caroline Moss, Gee Thanks, Just Bought It shares all the life-changing, under-the-radar products you didn't think you needed. What do I mean by that, you ask? Well, how about hand warmers that double as phone chargers, foot hammocks, fake shirt collars, the perfect spatula, full-face ice masks, yeah, they exist, and much more. Her mission is not to get you to buy everything, but to hear from trusted guests about the products you may be looking for. Listen to New York Times bestselling author Ellen Hillebrand on why you need a pepper grinder, Birchbox co-founder Molly Chen on her tiny tongs obsession, and author-comedian Samantha Irby's favorite travel bidet. And of course, we'll hear from the guru herself on something she's loving that week. Shop and subscribe now to Gee Thanks, Just Bought It, wherever you listen to podcasts.